Hey everybody, welcome to video number 2 for chapter 24, and in this one we're going to be talking about the partition of Africa. So in the previous video we gave a broad overview of the new era of European imperialism. We went over the reasons why European nations looked to conquer overseas territories, how they accomplished it, and the different forms of imperial rule. The remaining sections of this chapter deal with specific regions that were conquered by European nations. This video deals with the area most often associated with European imperialism, and we're talking about Africa. And it was also the region probably the most heavily exploited by it, and the area that is still seeing a lot of the negative after effects of European colonialism even to this day. And we call this the partition of Africa. Right? Partition means the action of dividing, and that's literally what Europe did with almost the entire continent. As you can see from the political cartoon, it was similar to a bunch of people just sitting around slicing up a cake, and each person, and they were representing different European countries, took a piece for himself. Now let's first talk about Africa in the early 1800s, just before Europe really started to conquer it. First thing to understand, though, is that Africa is a huge continent. In America, we tend to think of Africa as just being a single racial or ethnic identity, right? African. And that's largely because the majority of people in America who are of African descent, African Americans, do not have a specific cultural identity from Africa because their ancestors were brought here as slaves. Still, it's important to know that it is a tremendously diverse continent with very, very different regions. Anyway, back to what Africa was like in the early 1800s. First, North Africa. North Africa was conquered by Islamic empires back during the Middle Ages and thus was mostly Muslim, still is to this day, and in the 1800s was part of the Ottoman Empire. Let me move me up here. Okay, so the Ottoman Empire was the last of those Islamic empires. It was centered around here, Istanbul and Turkey, right? This is today Turkey, but you see at times it even controlled Greece, but all of this area in northern Africa, Egypt, areas of Algeria, Tunisia, and so forth. Okay, although by the 1800s, the Ottoman Empire was in significant decline. You see this is in 1815, and it had lost a lot of its territory. Now, West Africa was also mostly Muslim due to trade with the Middle East. Now, you see here, remember talking about this last year, the gold and salt trade that went from these areas across the Sahara Desert to the Middle East. But West Africa, these are the countries that we have today. Some of those ancient kingdoms that we talked about, Mali, Ghana, right, they're still called, you still have countries that are named for those today. You did have Islamic kingdoms, as I said. Many of them would have been in what today would be Upper Nigeria. And then in some of these forest kingdoms like Benin and Togo in and around here, you had states that had traded with European and Arab merchants to increase their wealth. Now, this region was decimated by the Atlantic slave trade. Let me first erase the pen marks, and then show you this one. Now, a map like this hopefully should ring a few bells with you from last year in Global 9, learning about this. I mean, it was just because of geography. The West Africa is along the Atlantic coast, so almost all the slaves that were brought to the Americas starting back in the 1500s were all from West Africa. And this region in particular was really, really hit hard by it. It completely destabilized it. Now, even though the slave trade had died out in the mid-1800s due to the success of European and American abolitionist movements, it left lasting marks on West Africa. Now, East Africa, also mostly Muslim, and so we're talking about East Africa in here, and that was because of its proximity to the Middle East. It had long done trade with Arab merchants. And here, the slave trade still existed. Right? You see this arrow here, right? So all of these arrows had pretty much died out by the 1800s, but this one right here, that continued, into the 20th century. You see, this is a photograph. The British, after they banned the slave trade, they actually captured this Muslim ship that was shipping all of these Africans into the Middle East for slavery. Now, southern Africa was a little bit of a different story. This was dominated by powerful tribes such as the Zulus. You see, this right here is your historic Zulu kingdom. And they were led by powerful leaders such as the famous war chieftain Shaka. Excuse my handwriting when I write on this, it's never very good. All right, but Shaka led them to kind of conquest throughout this area, and it pushed other tribes out of the way, but they built up a sizable kingdom, and this conquest brought them into conflict with people down here in the Cape Colony, and they were known as the Boers. Now, Boers were Europeans who were descended from Dutch immigrants who had settled in southern Africa back in the 16 and 1700s. You see, this is a Dutch flag. So even though you see here British Empire, disregard that for now. We're going to talk about that more in a second. And they had established farming communities there and had lived there for a while. And the colony that they established, it does say here, is called the Cape Colony. All right, here's Cape Town. That is still, even to this day, a large city in South Africa. And eventually they came into conflict with the Zulus up here after they were driven from the Cape Colony by the British. The British won control of this in 1814. Now, not wanting to live under British rule, the Boers migrated north, as I just said, and they went right into Zulu territory, leading to war between the two. The Boers were ultimately victorious due to their superior weapons, right? They had European rifles and guns and things like that. But we're going to talk a little bit more about the British control in South Africa in a couple minutes. So that's what Africa looked like in the early 1800s. Now let's discuss how European contact increases. From the 1500s to the 1700s, Europeans really only traded along the African coasts. And this was mostly for slaves, right? The transatlantic slave trade. We remember from last year that Europeans didn't do a lot of actual conquering of Africa for slaves, instead relying on trading. Okay, here you see Africans, right? They're trading other Africans. This guy's being traded to the Europeans in exchange for guns and alcohol and manufactured goods and things like that. Africans were able to resist European advancement since European technology at this time wasn't that much more advanced. Oh, hit that by accident, so just I'll get to that in a second. So it didn't really make that much of a difference. Additionally, you had very, very dense jungles in the interior of Africa, and African diseases were big obstacles to European conquest. That all changed after the Industrial Revolution, though, when you had technology and medicine, and this allowed them to push much farther inland. You had things like steamships, right? That allowed you to go upriver into the interior of Africa. Railroads, okay, they were being laid. You had medicine, right, to combat these tropical diseases and made them less deadly. But most importantly, they had guns, right? They had machine guns. They had bigger and badder guns. So along with the conquerors, you also had Christian missionaries. Now, remember we said in the last video how many Europeans viewed imperialism as a religious mission. They wanted to spread Christianity among the Africans. Well, these missionaries, they often did some good. They would build schools. They'd build medical clinics. Okay, for the missionaries, it wasn't just about conquest and subjugation, but a negative aspect of it is that they often took what we call a paternalistic view of Africans, meaning they looked at Africans as children. Pater, the root there, is Latin for father, right? They viewed themselves as superior, so they looked at the Africans as children who needed guidance rather than adults. They believed they knew best and often looked down upon African culture and religion. So now that we've given some background as well as discussed some ways in which Europeans began increasing their presence in Africa, let's get into the actual conquest itself. This is often referred to as the scramble for Africa due to the tremendous competition among European countries to grab as much land as possible. By the late 1800s, this competition threatened to spill into war between European countries. So leaders of the European nations decided to meet in order to figure things out. This meeting was called the Berlin Conference. It took place in Berlin, obviously, in the year 1884. And the leaders of all the major European countries were there. Notice how you see a common trait among all of them, all old white guys. All right. Sadly, but not surprisingly, no African leaders were present or even invited to discuss their own fates. You know, the logic there is why invite children to sit at the adults' table? Africa was divided up. So now let's look at a few of the specific regions that were awarded to European nations, starting with Belgium. Now you think Belgium, you know, where is even Belgium? Belgium is a tiny country in northwest Europe, but interestingly enough, it was the first European nation to set off the scramble for Africa. It controlled the Congo River Valley, which is a very large area almost in the center of the African continent. Very rich in natural resources like coal, like ivory, and especially rubber. Rubber was originally taken from the sap of tropical trees, and it was big money for the Belgians. Remember we talked about in the beginning of the last chapter how rubber was one of those new natural resources that was valuable in the later Industrial Revolution. All right, so this was getting them a lot of money. But unfortunately, the Belgians were known for their very, very brutal rule. Africans were forced to work under unthinkable conditions. They were worked to death, they were starved to death, and mutilations were common in order to ensure workers met their quotas. Mutilation means the disfiguring of something on the body. The favored method was chopping off of hands. Here you see these African workers. Those are hands that they're holding. All right. This was very, very gruesome. And unfortunately and tragically, let me move me out of the way here. Even children were not exempt from this. Okay, you see the young boy here and the young girl, both missing hands. Belgian atrocities eventually ended, but they continued to exploit the Congo for its natural resources. Now, France. France took a very large share of Africa. It conquered a large part of both northwest and central Africa, Algeria and Tunisia in the north, as well as large sections through the center. Okay, so you got French Equatorial Africa through the center and here in the north. At its height, the French Empire was as large as the size of the continental United States. So they controlled thousands of miles. Britain, on the other hand, was a little smaller than the French one, but even though it doesn't really look too much, but they took over more valuable areas, such as Egypt through Sudan. You think, why is that a big deal? Because what runs through all this? The Nile River. All right, and then they have coastlines. They have all of southern Africa. So they took over areas that were a bit more populated, and also some areas that had very rich natural resources. Now, we mentioned earlier in the video how the British took over South Africa and drove the Boers out of the Cape Colony. Eventually, this would culminate in the Boer War. The Boers eventually set up their own republics to the north of the Cape Colony. Let me move me down here. I've got to do this quick because I'm running out of time. All right, so the blue area, this is British. And this, we'll put D for Dutch, even though you think, well, shouldn't it be B for Boers? Well, I don't want both to be B, all right, because remember, the Boers were Dutch. So these were Dutch republics. They fled the Cape Colony, and they established those up here in the north. And the British didn't really care too much about these colonies until gold and diamonds were discovered up in here. All of a sudden now, the British wanted a piece of that action. So war broke out. Now, the British eventually won and united the different regions into the Union of South Africa in 1910. A constitution was created in this. Actually, let me just show you the map. Okay, so now all of these areas, the Transvaal, the Free Orange State, these were mostly Boer regions, but you notice how they're all now part of the same South Africa. And this new constitution created a system based on strict racial segregation, but we'll talk more about that in later chapters. Now, not many Africans were willingly conquered. You know, they resisted, as you can imagine. The French fought against the Algerians in North Africa. The British fought against the Zulus in Southern Africa. However, regardless of how brave the Africans fought, very, very few were successful. They were almost entirely unsuccessful. Africans simply didn't have the firepower to stand against the industrialized weapons of the European militaries. There were a few exceptions, though, really two. Ethiopia and Liberia. Ethiopia managed to resist conquest by modernizing, plus it didn't have a ton in the way of natural resources, so it wasn't a big target. And Liberia, interestingly enough, this is when West Africa was spared because it was founded as a freed slave colony by the United States. You guys will learn a little bit more about that next year. But outside of these two countries, I mean, you look at Africa in 1914, gray is the independent. You got Liberia and you got Ethiopia. That's it. Every other inch of the entire continent is colored in some way that represents control by a European country. And notice how it's not just the British and the French. Portugal was in on this. Germany was in on this. Spain, Italy, all right? They all wanted to get a piece of this scramble for Africa. And this almost total conquest of the continent would have huge ramifications for years to come and even to the present day. All right, so a lot that we went over in this chapter, but as I said, this is in this section, but this is an important one. In the next section, we're going to get into the British conquest of India.